Welcome, everyone. As you're joining us, I'm going to do a little preamble and let you know what to expect tonight. We're just really excited to have you here in honor of our Gratitude Week special event, in particular in honor of our 101st birthday today. That's right, 101 years ago, Compass was founded in Pioneer Square by Reverend Otto Karlstrom. And actually, our original service center was a day center called the Lutheran Sailors and Loggers Mission, which was operated much like our current day center is today. And in fact, our current day center over at the Compass Center in Pioneer Square is located just a couple blocks away from our original site. So we're really happy that you're with us here celebrating today. We had around 80 RSVPs for this event, so we expect a great crowd. Thank you so much for being here. For those of you who aren't super familiar with the Zoom platforms, in particular the Zoom webinar platform, things run a little differently. I'll go ahead and minimize the screen share so you can see us. So at the bottom of your viewing box, you should see a chat and a Q&A if you hover your mouse kind of down lower in that area. What we'll be doing tonight is taking your questions throughout the presentation at any point through that Q&A function. We'll be able to see your questions, either answer them immediately or defer them to ask at the end of the various pieces of the presentation. We are doing it this way because we've needed to enhance our security just a little bit. Gregg has had some trolls at some of his meeting who I guess don't love housing or research. And we're trying to make sure that the presentation stays safe for everyone tonight and that we can get through it clearly. So we encourage you to ask questions. We think that Gregg's presentation will probably spur many of them. The presentation will last about 30 minutes, and then we'll have that time for the Q&A. And then as that winds down, Mary Steele, who is our executive director, and David Duea, who is the CEO of Lutheran Community Services Northwest, will then join us, and they will give us an update on Compass, where we are now and where we're headed. And then again, there'll be time to ask questions in this chat function throughout, and they'll be answered there at the end. We're hoping to keep our runtime to no more than 90 minutes, hopefully more like 75. Because we know it's your Wednesday evening. And I think I covered everything I need to do. Gregg, we are so excited to have you here. And I'm gonna turn the presentation over to you now.
Thanks, Liz. I appreciate the invite, and thanks all for taking some time out this evening to hear my presentation. So I'm gonna share my screen here. Okay. Liz, are you able to see that okay? Great. Okay. Well, my name is Gregg Colburn. I am from the University of Washington, and I have a book coming out early next year called Homelessness as a Housing Problem, and have begun doing a lot of talks around on this particular topic. And so I'm pleased to be with you here tonight to share some of the key arguments that we make in the book. This is what it looks like. It's going to be kind of fun when it comes out. And the reason I wanted to write the book is I moved to Seattle about just over 4 years ago. This is my 5th year at UW. And I've been engaged in a lot of conversations with community leaders and policymakers and just people who are walking around Seattle who can't figure out what the heck is going on. And my observation after sitting in a lot of these conversations is that we lack a consensus around the fundamental root cause of homelessness in Seattle. And as a result, our policy responses haven't been targeted appropriately, which helps to explain why we continue to see this problem get worse day by day. And my fear is that if we continue to play whack-a-mole with a variety of different explanations, this problem will continue to grow and flourish, and which is obviously a tragedy for the people experiencing homelessness, and it's really bad for our community. And so my hope was to really center the idea of what is causing this in Seattle and other coastal cities where homelessness is big, and therefore kind of orient the conversation around solutions to address the root cause of this particular crisis. And my colleague Clayton Aldern joined me in this project. Clayton is a journalist and data scientist and is amazing with graphics. And so a lot of the graphs and charts that you see are a product of his good work. And he has a background in working in homelessness. He actually worked for Pierce County for a while before becoming a journalist, thinking about homelessness and doing a lot of the analytical work for Pierce County, just down south of ways. So when we start to think about homelessness, the first question that people say, well, what causes homelessness? And causation is something that I, as a professor and a social scientist, think a lot about. And causation's hard. Sometimes causation is easy. Like if we drop a pencil and say what caused that, we'd say gravity. That's pretty easy. But when we start to ask about kind of complex social situations, what causes homelessness, then we start scratching our head. Right? And people have lots of opinions about this. And we ask people experiencing homelessness, what's their cause? And we get all sorts of answers. And because we don't really have a good sense of what's driving this, then what do we do? Do we treat this symptom? Do we build housing? Do we send people to treatment? What do we, do we give people money, et cetera, et cetera? So that's the challenge that we have. There's the pencil bouncing. That's the easy one. And so as part of the point in time count, which is the census that we conduct every year, I guess we didn't do it last year because of COVID, but the census that we usually conduct every year to count the number of people experiencing homelessness, there's also a survey where we ask people, what conditions led you to experience homelessness? And what we see is a range of different explanations here. And when this gets reported in the press, typically people will refer to these things as causes. And I always scratch my head a little bit when I see these lists, because I fundamentally don't believe that these are root causes. If divorce and separation were really the cause of homelessness, we should have a heck of a lot more homelessness, given the rate of divorce and separation in marriages in the United States. And so the way that I like to think about these events these situations, I prefer to call them precipitating events rather than root causes. The point being that any one of these events clearly could lead to a bout of homelessness, right? An argument with a roommate kicks me out, I don't have resources to find another place, and I could end up experiencing homelessness. So I would call that a precipitating event, and it's something that is certainly very important to understand, but I don't necessarily think it's the root cause, right? And so what we're trying to do is identify what things are precipitating events and what are root causes, and therefore, if we can get at that root, we have a greater chance of having some success in dealing with this crisis. And so the way to identify the concept of a precipitating event versus a root cause is this analogy or vignette here about musical chairs. And so imagine a game of musical chairs, 10 friends in a circle. The leader starts 10 chairs, 10 friends. The leader starts the music, everyone walks around. The leader pulls one chair out, and we now have 10 people in 9 chairs. The music stops and everyone scrambles for a chair. And in this case, the loser, Mike, was on crutches after spraining his ankle, and Mike lost. He ended up without a chair. And so if we were to interview Mike or the other people in the game, why did Mike lose the game? Everyone would say, well, Mike had a bad ankle. And that's a true statement. And so would we say that his ankle injury caused his chairlessness? Well, that's a difficult question, because under the specific terms and conditions of the game, 9 chairs and 10 people, then yes, I think Mike's ankle injury probably did cause him to lose the game. But if the rules of the game were different, 10 chairs and 10 people, Mike would have found a chair. Might just have taken a little longer, right? So this is this idea of the root cause of Mike's chairlessness was the fact that we didn't have enough chairs, right? His ankle injury presented him or identified him as the person who was likely to lose that game. And I feel like what's happening in Seattle and other coastal cities right now is just a much more tragic version of this story, which is when we don't have enough housing, it's people with vulnerabilities, be they physical, mental, addiction, poverty, et cetera, are identified to lose their housing. So we know from research that drug use, mental illness, poverty absolutely increase the risk of homelessness at the individual level. There's no doubt about that. But what's interesting is that we observe that these conditions produce homelessness in some contexts, like Seattle, San Francisco, LA, but not others, right? Which is a bit of a head scratcher. And so we need to explore this a little bit more deeply. And so the central question that we explore in the book is, why do rates of homelessness vary so widely throughout the United States? And so, for example, Seattle has 4 to 5 times the per capita rate of homelessness of Chicago. Why is that? And so an obvious explanation for that would be, if we know that these individual vulnerabilities, addiction, mental illness, and poverty, increase the risk of homelessness, it might be that we just have more of those people in this community and therefore have higher rates of homelessness. That's a plausible explanation. and one that we test in the book. And so this is a book about cities, not about people. And it's not that the people aren't important, they're terribly important. But what we're trying to do is understand what is going on at a regional level to explain these huge disparities. And so that's why we target the city. And so the individually focused research is super important. That will continue. We want to continue that research, but it doesn't necessarily help us understand regional variation, which is the goal. And so the thesis, just to give you the punchline here, is that tight housing markets provide the best explanation for this regional variation, meaning where housing is expensive and vacancy rates are low, that's where homelessness thrives. And in these tight housing markets, that accentuates vulnerabilities and identifies people to experience homelessness in a particular city where housing is really, really tight. And so it's a sorting mechanism, right? So if we don't have enough housing and housing costs continue to go up and we end up seeing vulnerable people on the street, that shouldn't surprise anyone, right? And so what we need to do is then rethink how we're structuring our built environment to ensure that that doesn't necessarily need to happen. Because if we don't change that, this will continue and perpetuate, unfortunately, in my opinion. So just to orient the conversation here a little bit, the way that we both count homelessness and the way we distribute funds from the federal government for homelessness go through geographic entities called continuums of care, COCs. And so each part of the country is covered by a COC, and jurisdictions have the right to kind of choose the boundaries for their COCs. And so some places have city-based COCs, like New York City, it's just the city. And other places like King County have county-based COCs. And one of the challenges when we compare homelessness is if we're looking at per capita rates in New York City, which is simply an urban area where homelessness tends to be more prevalent, to a county location where there are suburban locations with lower rates of homelessness, we're going to get a mixed signal. We're going to say, oh, New York is much worse than King County. And so what we have to do when we're comparing is we need to compare cities to cities and then counties to counties separately. So that's what we do here. So at the top here is what we see is these are all the city-based COCs in our sample. And what you'll see is New York, DC, San Francisco, and Boston on the very right end here with 9 to 10 people per 1,000 experiencing homelessness, which is about a 5-to-1 ratio from the low cities, Detroit, Chicago, Indianapolis. And if we move to the counties, the numbers are lower because of the suburban dynamic that I talked about. But what's interesting is the high counties, LA, Santa Clara, King County, Multnomah, which is Portland, are also about 5-to-1 versus the low counties. And so what we're trying to explain in the book is why do we have this 5-to-1 ratio? That's the purpose. So let's start with individual explanations, because those are the ones that if you're just walking down the street, a lot of people would say, well, it's drug use or it's poverty. And so let's test that and see if that helps us understand this variation. And so the only statistics here tonight is this number R squared, which is a measure of variation explained. And so what this is saying is 14% of the variation between rates of homelessness is explained by poverty rates. Okay, and that's a modest explanatory power. We'd like to see 2.2, 0.3, 0.4 before we really start to think that there's something going on here. But what's really interesting about this is it's in the opposite direction that we would expect. So what we're seeing here on the bottom here, these are rates of poverty. And where poverty rates are higher, homelessness is lower. And so not only does it not provide a good explanation, it actually makes the opposite argument that we would expect. Okay, so poverty increases the risk at the individual level, but it's actually the opposite relationship at the community level. The cities over here are Baltimore, Detroit, Cleveland, places with high rates of poverty actually have low rates of homelessness. And so what we see is that homelessness tends to thrive in relatively affluent communities like Seattle and San Francisco. So it's not that we have more poor people here in Seattle, which is why we have a problem with homelessness. We then move and look at rates of serious mental illness and drug use using data at the state level, because that's where a lot of the good data on these conditions are kept. And so what this is looking at is rates of homelessness across states over all the years in our sample. And what we see here is an R squared of 0.05, which basically means there's no relationship. There are places with more people with serious mental illness, and there are places with fewer people, but has no relationship whatsoever to homelessness. So it's not that places with high problems with or big problems with homelessness have lots of people with serious mental illness. There's no relationship. There are people with mental illness in every community and in every state, but it's not that there's disproportionality there to explain the problem of homelessness. The same is true when we look at rates of illicit drug use. Again, we see variation in rates of illicit drug use, but there's no relationship, statistically speaking, to rates of homelessness. And this is rates of substance use disorder, which would include legal drugs like marijuana in the state of Washington, or alcohol use. And again, what we see is a very, very modest relationship, 0.06. Basically, statistically speaking, is no relationship. So it's not that we have more addicts or drug users or people abusing alcohol in places with high rates of homelessness. It's just not the case. The anecdote that I use, people will say, I don't believe that. You know, if we think about West Virginia, which is the home of the opioid epidemic in the United States, it is an absolute human tragedy. The one problem they don't have there is homelessness, right? And so if opioid addiction was a cause of homelessness, we should see massive levels of homelessness in West Virginia, and we don't. We don't, because they find a place. Okay? So it's not disproportional numbers of people with these conditions that explain this regional variation. So the next category of explanations that we like to think about are local context. And I hear about this all the time when I'm out in the community talking about homelessness. The first one that we look at is temperature. People say, well, it's mild on the West Coast, therefore we have a lot of homelessness. And we actually see a modest relationship between weather and homelessness in cities, but no relationship at all in counties. And so we actually take one more statistical step here to put them together, and we index them. And what we see is, again, basically no relationship. And so there are warm places with lots of homelessness. San Diego and LA are prime examples. And it certainly fits the narrative, but there are also cold places with lots of homelessness. New York, Boston, Minneapolis Minneapolis has relatively high rates of homelessness, right? And so the point here is that the story fits in your mind pretty easily, but then you think about warm places like Miami or Dallas or Phoenix that have warm weather in the wintertime, and they don't have big homelessness problems, right? And so the point here is that weather doesn't explain regional variation in homelessness at all. And we can find examples, kind of counter examples, when you just kind of tick through the cities in your mind. And so that's not it. We can't really blame weather for this. One thing that's frequently talked about is generosity of benefits. And so what we've done here is looking at the state level. The primary federal welfare program is called TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. And this would be, when people talk about welfare, that's typically the program that they're talking about. And so what we wanted to do is look at, when I should back up, under Bill Clinton's welfare reform in 1996, one of the key things was to provide a lot of decision-making to local states. And that's kind of the ethos of policymaking in the US. And so what we see is huge variation in generosity of benefits under TANF from state to state. And so we decided to say, well, this is kind of interesting. Let's look at the purchasing power of those benefits, meaning the maximum welfare benefit divided by the cost of housing in each of these states. And what we see is huge variation in generosity. And is there any relationship to homelessness? Meaning, are people moving to places with generous benefits, which is frequently an argument that I hear. And so what we see is that there is big variation in generosity. There's variation in homelessness, but it doesn't correlate at all. There's no relationship. So we don't see any evidence of disproportionate homelessness where generosity is high. Okay. And another way to think about this is people say, well, people are moving here, right, to be homeless because it's an easier place to be homeless, or their services, or whatever the case may be. And so what we looked at in this analysis was the rate of low-income migration. So this is the percentage of people moving to a community that are below the federal poverty line. And so what we see here is that actually, again, like poverty, there's a negative relationship, meaning the more people you have below the federal poverty line moving to your community on a percentage basis, you actually have lower rates of homelessness. And so these dots are, the high homelessness places tends to have very, very few low-income people moving to that community. And so again, it's not that we have this magnet effect. People aren't necessarily moving here to be homeless, and we don't have this huge influx of low-income households moving to our region. Now, are there people below the poverty line moving here? Sure there are, as there are in every community, but there's no disproportionality. And I've heard this over and over. When I was doing graduate work in Minneapolis, everyone believed that it was Chicago people moving to Minneapolis, which is why we had a homelessness problem. And that proved to not be the case. And when I moved here to Seattle, people said, well, it's people moving up from California. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I heard that in Minneapolis. And California believed they're a magnet. And actually in the book, cite an article about Middletown, Ohio, where they were arguing that they were a magnet for homelessness, right? And so the point is that everyone can't be a magnet. And generally speaking, there's really very little evidence to support this, even though it's still a really powerful narrative out there. And then finally, politics frequently gets blamed. And in fact, there was a very high profile public debate between Governor Newsom of California and President Trump prior to the last election, where they were each blaming each other for homelessness. And ultimately, it's difficult to blame the federal government, although they do share some of this blame, because if retrenchment from the federal government caused this, it doesn't really explain why some places have a bigger problem than others. And when we think about local politics, people frequently blame left-leaning Democrats for this, but in our sample of cities, it's about 30 cities in our sample, Democrats run cities in the United States, generally speaking. So 85% of the time, Democrats were in charge of the cities in our sample. And so if Democratic policies were to blame for high rates of homelessness in Seattle and San Francisco and LA, what about Cleveland and Detroit, which are real Democratic strongholds, right? So the point is that, again, that explanation doesn't really help us understand this huge difference between cities and rates of homelessness. So the last category that we look at are housing market conditions, and this is where we start to get some real explanatory power, statistically speaking. And so what you'll see now is some R-squared numbers that we haven't seen in other slides, which are much higher. And this is looking at median contract rent for the cities in our sample. And what we see is where rent is expensive, homelessness is much higher. And that's true in both cities and counties. It's also true when we look at vacancy rates. When rental market vacancy rates are low, when you have a real tight market, homelessness tends to be quite a bit higher, right? And so the punchline of the book is that if you were to give me rents in a city and vacancy rates in that city, I could give you a pretty good estimate of the rates of homelessness, or tell you, yeah, you're gonna have a problem, or no, you aren't, right? And so we kind of know, the data is very clear in terms of what is driving this disproportionality. The question is kind of, what do we do about it, or why did we get into this situation? And so frequently in Seattle, people say, well, okay, that's fine, it's housing costs, Greg, it's because of Amazon people moving to Seattle, right? And we've had a ton of people come here, and I'll say, yes, that's true. That's certainly part of the story. And so what we did is we took another step and said, looked at population growth. And this actually really surprised me because I was expecting to see more of a story. There is no relationship between population growth and homelessness. And I was shocked by this. So there are places that are growing very fast. There are places that are not growing as fast, but generally speaking, it has no relationship to homelessness. And I was like, boy, that's weird, because Boston, Seattle, San Francisco are all growing pretty quickly. But when you actually look at the data, there are a bunch of southern cities that are growing very fast. Charlotte, North Carolina, Austin, Texas, Phoenix, Arizona, all are growing quickly and don't have a housing crisis. And so the point is that the demand side of the thing, which is the number of people moving to your community and the dollars they have to spend on housing, is certainly part of the story, but it's not the whole story. What we have to think about is the supply side, which is how many housing units do we have? So to help kind of orient this a little bit for everyone, what I wanted to do is kind of create this typology for you. And this is one bit, I had one piece of statistics for you, and I've got one little bit of economics. And there's no test, I promise. But I'm going to talk about this notion of supply elasticity. And so the idea of supply elasticity is when prices for a good change, what happens to the supply of that good? And so the example I always use is a pen, because I usually have one sitting right next to me. So if the price of pens goes up by a whole bunch, pen manufacturers are going to manufacture a whole bunch more, because they could make more money from manufacturing pens, right? And they can just go to 3 shifts, they can go 24 hours, et cetera, et cetera. So the point is, it's pretty easy to make more pens when prices go up. So the supply elasticity of pens would be pretty high. Now, in contrast, if the price of housing goes up a whole bunch today, what do we see tomorrow in terms of a supply response? We see no supply response, right? Because housing takes a long time to build. And so generally speaking, the supply elasticity of housing is lower than a lot of other goods. But within the United States, there's actually quite a bit of variation between housing supply elasticity from city to city, okay? And what we know is that some places are easier to build for a variety of reasons. If Topeka, Kansas is pretty easy to build, it's flat as a pancake, you can go out as far as you want, and the regulatory environment is pretty accommodating. Okay, Seattle and San Francisco with mountains, with water, challenging topography plus regulatory environment that makes it hard to build housing leads to very, very inelastic housing markets. And so this graphic then puts the demand side, meaning the change in population, together with the supply side, which is supply elasticity. And what we start to see here is sort of a story that starts to explain why we have housing crises in some cities and not others. Okay, so the bottom right here, this quadrant down to the lower right, is the perfect storm for a housing crisis. You have very rapid population growth, which means a lot of demand for housing, and you have very inelastic housing supplies, meaning we just haven't built enough housing. And the numbers in parentheses are the rental vacancy rates in those cities. And what you'll see is they're razor thin. Those are super low vacancy rates, right? That's an indication of a market that's in a deficit position. So the bubble above Boston, Seattle, and San Francisco is the Sun Belt. And so Charlotte has grown almost as fast as Seattle over the last decade. But what has happened is they've built an incredible amount of housing to basically keep up. And as a result, their housing costs are quite a bit lower. And you can see the vacancy rate is still much, much higher. And so this can be explained through fairly simple supply and demand analysis, in the sense that if you've got a lot of people moving to your community and you don't build housing to accommodate them, you're going to have a problem. And we do, and we will continue to have a problem unless we change the trajectory. And so one way to fix this is you become St. Louis, Detroit, Cleveland, or Chicago, where people are leaving, right? Because of kind of the Rust Belt dynamics that we've all followed over the last few decades. But that's not necessarily what we want. We don't want industrial decline as a way to fix homelessness, but it is one path, right? Ideally, we figure out how to accommodate the people who want to come and live here and work here. And so, you know, as I said, there's a couple ways to get to low rates of homelessness. One is you're the Rust Belt and you're Detroit and all auto manufacturing moves overseas, or you're the Sun Belt and you grow a lot and you build a lot of housing. The problem is that if you don't do that and you have inelastic supply and you have growth in Seattle, San Francisco, Boston, New York, you're going to have a housing crisis with high rates of homelessness. So to wrap up here, and then we'll get to Q&A, which will, I look forward to hearing your thoughts on all this. But, you know, I really think ultimately we need to have a concerted effort on the housing supply side in communities like Seattle and the Puget Sound region if we are going to address this issue. And to date, we've largely made operating investments. And so these would be investments to fund supportive services and shelters and things like that, and also providing funds to nonprofit organizations who are providing, you know, life-saving services, which is great. And we need to continue that. But that really is treating the problem. It's not nipping it in the bud at its source, right? And so ultimately, if we're going to stop this or really change the curve on homelessness, we need to make capital investments to construct housing. And the private market has a role to play. We want the private market to build as much housing as they can. We need to change zoning and think about how can we get more units in each parcel in Seattle, because we're not making any more land. But we also need government involvement, because the private market cannot build housing profitably and charge people $500, $600, $700 a month. The math simply doesn't work based on land costs and construction costs in our region. And so I believe there is a role for the government to help support nonprofit builders and public builders to ensure that we have a much greater stock of housing that's affordable for people with incomes, you know, below the median and much below that. You know, there's a role for the federal government. Right now, the federal government doesn't provide a lot of money for low-income housing support. It's about $55 billion a year, which is a really small slice of a $1.3 trillion discretionary federal budget. And in fact, for all of us on this call who are homeowners, you know, we have been the beneficiary of the mortgage interest tax deduction, which in fact, before the Trump tax cuts in 2017, cost the government more money than we gave to low-income housing support. So generally speaking, the federal government has privileged those who are homeowners and has encouraged home ownership really to the detriment of low-income households. And so this discrepancy helps to explain some of the real challenges we have in our housing system in the United States. So what would it take? In our region, people say, well, what do we need to do? McKinsey and Company, the consultancy, did a really good report, actually 2 reports in the last couple of years. And their math suggested that we need about 37,000 new units in our region for extremely low-income households who are either experiencing homelessness or at risk. And the cost of that would be about $11 billion over 10 years, which is, $1 billion a year for 10 years, which is about 4x what we're spending right now. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money, but it's but the money does exist in this community. So that's not insurmountable. And when you think about what our region has done in terms of other infrastructure expenditures, we're spending $54 billion on transit over 25 years. And so it's really gets down to, we're not afraid of making big investments that are critical for our region to continue to grow and thrive. But the issue with housing is typically we think of housing as a private good. We don't think about it as public infrastructure. And I do think changing our thought process around that would help maybe get the investments that we need to move forward. Because ultimately, even private industry can't continue to thrive in this region if we have such a dire shortage of housing, which is why you're seeing Microsoft and Amazon now contributing corporate capital to housing, which I certainly would not have expected 15 years ago, because they're recognizing this shortage is really affecting private industry and families throughout our region. And so people say, well, Greg, what would you do if you had a magic wand? I would say there would be two things that I would want to do. One is I would like to see the federal government make housing vouchers, which is our primary federal housing support and entitlement. Right now, only about 1 in 5 people who are eligible get that benefit. If you made that an entitlement, it would cost about $60 to $100 billion a year at the federal government, which is a lot of money, but it would provide tremendous amount of purchasing power to low-income households. Now, that's great if you have a lot of housing units where people can use those vouchers, right? But in our region, we don't. And so we would need to pair that federal commitment with a local commitment to develop affordable housing, meaning this is where we could actually place people when they have a voucher. And so if we did that kind of $10 billion commitment in our region, commitment to affordable housing, pair that with housing vouchers at the federal level, I think we could make a huge, huge dent in what we're seeing in terms of the homelessness and housing crisis in our region. Now, those are two really big political asks. I'm not going to hold my breath, but that would be one pathway to making a real dent in this. And so to conclude, I believe that continuing to diagnose homelessness as a problem of the individual really will continue to undermine our efforts to prevent and end this crisis. And if we continue to do that, I think we will continue to live in this environment that I don't think anyone is happy about, right? This is a structural problem, and we need structural solutions to end it. And those structural solutions mean we need more housing. And so we do have one example, one shining example, which is the dramatic fall in veteran homelessness in the United States over the last decade. We made a political decision to make sure that people who served in the armed forces and coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan weren't homeless. And we've cut it by 50% in the last decade. And we did that by providing housing. And so we know it works. Housing does work to end homelessness. The question is, will we have the political will and devote the resources that we need to end it? Thanks much. That's my talk, and I look forward to hearing what questions or comments you have.
Thanks very much, Greg. I've heard your presentation a few times, and I always pick up new things to think about, and really appreciate your research. I realized earlier in the meeting, I neglected to introduce myself. My name's Liz Gerard, and I'm the Director of Advancement for Compass Housing Alliance, and it's nice to be here with you all tonight. So we're going to get to some questions. First one comes from Mike, who asks, I've heard about zoning laws being a major cause. Can you speak to that and also comment about upzoning and the challenges, et cetera, in doing so?
Great question. So, single family zoning is a dominant form of city planning in most cities around the United States, with the exception of New York City, right? You don't see a lot of single family homes if you're, walking around Manhattan. But Seattle is generally zoned about 70% single family, which means that you cannot construct anything other than a single family home on those parcels. And what has created a real challenge for Seattle is if 70% of your parcels are zoned single family and you continue to have the population growth that we're experiencing in our community, the only place you can put those new people are in those 30% of parcels that are not zoned single family. And ultimately, the whole system starts to crumble if you can't expand housing options beyond only the 30% of parcels that are zoned for multifamily housing. And so what we're seeing in Minneapolis, and certainly in Seattle and in Portland and now in the state of California, is a recognition that the single family zoning has, to a certain extent, been exclusionary over time. And what we're seeing at the local level is the politics around single family zoning are very, very difficult. And the reason being is that people bought a single family home and they like the neighborhood in which they live. And I understand, I'm living in a single family home right now. And so I appreciate and understand that. But there what we're seeing is that people who, actually my favorite example of this, I teach it in my class, is a single family home in Wallingford during the debate about upzoning. And in the front yard, it was in 2016, this household had a Bernie Sanders for president sign in their yard, and right next to it, it said no upzones. Right. And so what we see is that people, even with very progressive or liberal ideology at the federal level or at the state level, tend to get far more conservative when it's their own street and their own house at play, saying, I don't want the character of my neighborhood to change. And so what we see, and there's a lot of really interesting political science literature on this, is how do you get people to move on this? Because ultimately it's been a major impediment in allowing cities to respond to the growth. And so ultimately what I tell people is, Seattle can't continue to be the city that it wants to be with 70% single family zoning. It just can't. It can't be a global city that's going to attract people because there's no place to put anyone. So ultimately the city will have to change, and it will be a bumpy process. It'll be a contested process, and that's just a reality of living in a dynamic global city. Right? There are very few cities around the globe, when you think about kind of big cities that you may have visited, that have a lot of single family zoning. Right? The United States is a little bit of an outlier on this.
Thank you. So speaking of cities moving on this, have there been an example of a city or a county that you can think of that has made significant progress in eliminating homelessness itself in the last 10 to 15 years, and how did they do it?
Yeah. So the short answer to your question is no, there is not a great case study. There are places that have done a great job. But generally speaking, they've had a lot of things working in their favor. And so while Dayton, Ohio was being elevated as doing an amazing job with homelessness, and so people actually from Hennepin County in Minnesota flew down there to say, what are you doing? You're doing such a great job. Well, 5 minutes into the meeting, they realized with someone's just basic welfare check, they could afford a 2-bedroom apartment. So they got people on welfare, and then they got an apartment for $500 and put them in there. And then all of a sudden they didn't have a homelessness problem. And so the point is that when you have abundant housing that's pretty cheap, and it's not to disparage the work they're doing. They did a great job. They took advantage of the situation that they had. That's not something that we enjoy in Seattle. And so it's not like we can take the success that Dayton had and apply it here, because the federal TANF check or welfare check gets you nowhere near what you need to afford housing. And so no, we don't have great examples of people or of communities, in these really expensive coastal cities making a big dent, unfortunately, because these investments are big and they take political courage, and so we just haven't gotten there. So that's sort of a depressing answer to a good question.
Well, speaking of political courage, if you could tell a city council or city council member one thing about homelessness based off your research, what would you say to them?
What I would say is that the people that you see on the street are the most vulnerable people, arguably, in society. They also represent a very small percentage of the total population of people experiencing homelessness. And so the chronic, unsheltered people who are struggling with mental illness and addiction is probably about 15-ish. I was running the numbers last night, about 15% of the total homeless population in King County. And so do we need to serve this population? Absolutely, right? We need to care for them, and I think we have a moral obligation to do so. But if we fool ourselves into thinking that we get people out of tents and encampments and then we've got the problem is fixed, we could take care of all of those people, house them tomorrow, and we would still have a massive homelessness problem in King County. That would be at the high levels of the nation. And so that visible piece, which troubles all of us and bothers a lot of people, and I understand that, is just the tip of the iceberg. There are a lot of women with children in shelters that you never see. There are people sleeping in cars that you never see, right? And so the point is that we equate this experience with that individual we see on the street who's really struggling, but that's really not a fair representation of the total population.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, a couple of years ago, the statistic was over 30,000 children currently homeless in Washington state and actively enrolled in school. So of those that, think about the children who can't be due to their homelessness.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah. So another question. So you've spoken about vouchers in your presentation. What about incentives to builders? We haven't seen developers choosing the incentives when the profits are greater, and to refuse the incentives to change the market rate. Can this be mandated?
Can this be mandated? Yeah. Well, there's a whole debate about rent control, which is a contested topic. I think there's a role for rent stabilization policies. I'm not convinced that that is going to be a panacea. Ultimately, to me, I would rather see more units out of the private market. And so if we think about this in the sense of you have basically 96% of the housing in the United States is procured through the private market. And there's a very small subset that's publicly owned or not in the private market. And so to me, the better answer is to have units that are under control of a nonprofit or the government that would allow us to preserve affordability over an extended period of time. And so I think that's super, super important. And so what I would like to do is provide government subsidy or incentives such that people can construct housing, keep it out of the market, maintain affordability in perpetuity, and then let the market do what it's doing. And I would also like to incent, and with zoning, you can obviously incent private developers to build more units on a specific parcel, right? Which would also help because we need a lot more market rate units as well. And so I think the federal low-income housing tax credit is a really powerful tool. It's somewhat inefficient, but it's a powerful tool to build more housing. And so I would like to see the feds and our actually congressional delegation in Washington is right on top of this and is a leader on this. If we had more tax credits that would allow both for-profit and nonprofit developers to build affordable units, that would be huge, and to keep them out of kind of the pressures of the private market that are so acute here in Seattle.
So of the other major US cities that are struggling like we are, do you see any of them closer to making some of the investments that are needed to make a dent? As far as you know?
I don't. I would say that there's really two models of response. There's an East Coast model and a West Coast model. And so the East Coast model, which began in New York City, is a model that is largely predicated on very large shelter capacity. And so what you see in Boston, New York, and DC is very, very high rates of homelessness, but actually very low rates of unsheltered homelessness because they have really massive shelter systems, right? And so they've got big problems with homelessness, but it's not unsheltered. And so the West Coast cities have a decision to make, which is, do we make long-term investments in permanent housing, or do we become a mini New York, which is to have a huge shelter capacity and get people off the streets, but then to a certain extent, New York is just warehousing people in a shelter system for decade after decade after decade and spending billions and billions and billions of dollars in the process. And so I think that is like a fundamental question that Seattle, San Francisco, Portland have to contest with is, what do we do? Do we really kind of double down on the shelter system, get people off the streets and deal with unsheltered homelessness, but then know that we're going to potentially have this backlog of people in a shelter system that we can't get out of? And so to me, it's a both, but I am not an advocate for only building shelters because we will have the same experience that New York does. And so we have got to figure out how to make these investments in permanent supportive housing. So no, people are trying. I mean, New York or California has had these ballot initiatives to raise billions of dollars to do this, and it's good, but if it's $11 billion in King County, it's 40, 50, 60 billion in California, and they're raising money at kind of billion-dollar chunks. It's just inadequate for the scale of the problem. And so, I feel better about it now than I did a couple of years ago because the awareness is there, and I think there's a greater willingness to make big investments because of the need, but we're way behind the 8 ball, unfortunately.
So Holly asks, have you studied more about foreign buyers and their money and their influence in buying up our market?
I haven't studied that a lot. It's certainly been an issue. It was a huge issue in Vancouver, actually, worse than here. But yeah, there is kind of the foreign buyer and then the Airbnb effect, which is taking units out of circulation. And so that is beginning to get some attention in big cities that are kind of tourist destinations, especially like San Francisco and New York. And so I think it's certainly an issue. I don't think getting rid of that is going to fix our problem. We still just need way more units. But on the margin, could that help if we got those units back into circulation? Probably. But I would say that would be my estimation would be a small effect.
One technical thing. Can you repeat the criteria? You mentioned needing to be eligible for vouchers.
Oh, yeah, what is it? It's basically you need to have an income below, I think it's 50 or 60% of area median income. So it's basically there's an income threshold, and if you're below that, you're eligible. But because of the shortage of vouchers, then you basically go on a wait list, and in many places you might be on a wait list for 5 years before you get a voucher. And so it's a basic income threshold, and it's a relatively low level of income, but it differs by community based on what prevailing incomes are in that area.
So last question we have in the chat, which is good timing. What responsibility do you believe big companies have in fixing the problem? And I'll add a little bit to that. And what about the average Seattleite as well?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. So I have been involved in conversations with Amazon and Microsoft on this. And whenever I get asked this question, I give kind of a two-faced answer. One is I'm grateful for their investments and their recognition that this is an issue. And so I think we're better off with their investments than without. But if I could do it over, I would rather have them keep their money and use their political will to make sure that we as a community and as a state fund our programs adequately, because ultimately the money from taxation far exceeds any contribution that Amazon and Microsoft are going to make. I also just don't think it's a good way to structure society to have private business taking care of social needs, because ultimately their attention may turn elsewhere at another time. Ultimately, they exist to sell things online and to create software, and they do a good job of that. And they should continue to do that. And I would love to see them stand up and recognize, and I think they do, that their growth and prosperity has contributed to the issue that we have. And therefore, we as a community, not just their companies, but we as a community have an obligation to think about how we then respond, and resources will be needed. And so, you know, the head tax debate I thought was unfortunate because I just didn't think the narrative was terribly helpful given the relatively small dollars that would have been raised through that. And so I'm hopeful that there can be a more productive conversation around revenue and taxation, and Amazon and Microsoft and other corporate leaders are at the table. What can individuals do? You know, it is such a large problem that you have kind of the spitting into the ocean problem here of like, am I making any impact? But I think every person on this call is making an impact just through your support of this organization. And so I would say continue to do that, support social services, nonprofit organizations, because they are on the front lines of dealing with this. But I think it also matters, and you know, politics matter. Who you vote for matters. And I won't tell you who to vote for, but I do think being engaged and thinking about the issues in terms of zoning and how we construct our city and how do we raise revenue and what do we do in Olympia, all these things really matter. And I think engagement is the first step to fixing this. And I think the other thing is just, I use every opportunity I can to just talk to people about this crisis and try to change some minds in terms of, if we continue to frame this as an individual problem and we've got people who are lazy or addicted, then we won't take the steps that we need. And so I try to change that narrative whenever I can, whether I'm having a glass of wine with friends or hanging out with buddies. So I think we all have a role to play.
Well, thank you, Greg. Thanks for being here today and helping educate us on your research. It's been really fascinating, and for us work at Compass and work on the ground, I think it's been nice to see our reality reflected in some hard numbers and some really great research. Greg came to our all staff meeting last week and spoke directly with all of our teams, so it was a really great privilege to have him there educating our staff as well. So I want to thank you for participating tonight.
Thanks, Liz.
Thanks. All right, I'm going to introduce Mary Steele, who's our executive director, and David Duea, who is the CEO of our affiliate, Lutheran Community Services Northwest, who are going to talk about Compass, a bit of a year in review and looking into the future. I'll get that slideshow going.
I am very sad that we can't meet in person. I would really love to be with you all and just being face to face. And we're very hopeful that we can perhaps find a way to do that next year. Today is our 101st anniversary. Any good Lutherans on the call will know that we share a birthday with Martin Luther. So we're very happy about that. I do want to show you something that you probably can't see, but I'm going to hold it up anyway. This is the minute book of the Compass mission from 1937 to 1941. It's been on my desk for the last few weeks, and I've really enjoyed getting a glimpse into the minds of the people who built Compass. And I want to read something to you from almost the last page. So we're very close to the end of the book. It's a special meeting of the Board of Directors, July 29th, 1941. It's entitled New Building. A brief meeting of the board was held to determine the color of paint to be used in renovating the building. It was agreed that straw color should be used on the outside of the windows. Inside, its walls will be ivory with Spanish gray trim around the windows. Thankfully, our board does not have to get quite that involved anymore, but I just want you to know that new building that it's talking about, we now call it the Carlstrom building. It was the Compass Center building in Pioneer Square, and we still use that building today. Our hygiene center is there, our client services center with our bank and mail, and we have 23 apartments there. And if we could move on to the next slide. This was a beautiful vision, I think, of that, a beautiful picture of that vision coming to life, because this is our newest building. The Carlstrom building is our oldest building, and this one is our Broadview building that opened in 2019 on what had been the parking lot of the Lutheran Memorial Church. There are 59 apartments with families and seniors and folks with disabilities. It's right across the street from Bellevue Thompson K-8 school, with which we have a very beautiful partnership. And I'm going to hold up another document. This is the monthly report that Ann Bailey, who is the manager, our manager at that program, provided to us for October. And I just want to give you a little glimpse of what is happening at Broadview. And because if you extrapolate that over our almost 700 apartments, these things are happening at every Compass location. So we have case managers at Broadview who work with the residents. And last month, they had 179 contacts to make connections with residents for wellness checks, coordinating healthcare services, employment, food access, housing stability. They had 139 contacts to talk about housing concerns, another 94 contacts to support vulnerable and at-risk households with health and safety concerns, coordinating with home health, medical care, DSHS, aging and disability. This is just a little sample. Now, at the same time, they're also working to create community with all the folks who are residing at Broadview. And so they had their second trunk or treat in partnership with the church. And I just want to read this to you because it makes me laugh. Case manager Tracy and I, that's Ann, participated. Tracy was a pumpkin. Volunteer EB was Sylvester Cat. I was a giraffe, and vehicle a cat. Residents, guests, staff, and community partners enjoyed the event. And then there are a whole bunch of pictures, which are very cool, which you can't see, unfortunately. So this photo here is the community room at Broadview, at our Broadview building. And it's beautiful. The building is beautiful. Our ultimate goal for every person who lives at Compass is that they would be treated with dignity, and that we could create the kind of community that allows people to thrive. Now, I could tell you 100 stories, but we only have a few minutes. And so I'm going to go to the numbers. And if we go to the next slide. So this is our 2020 financials. I will tell you that 2021 is tracking to be very close to these results. We had about 21.2 million in revenue and 23.6 million in expenses. For those of us who aren't accounting geeks, I want you to know that 5 million of those expenses weren't actually dollars that went out the door. They were what we call depreciation. We have a lot of very expensive buildings, and so we have to write down a portion of the value of those buildings every year. We're actually very happy with these results. And if we could look at the expenses by category, I think you'll see that we do a good job with the dollars that we receive from you. In large part, those dollars are spent on our programs and not on overhead. And honestly, we should be spending a little more on overhead, because that's what allows us to invest in creating a strong organization. And we're looking at that and how we can invest wisely to make Compass as strong as it can be. And if we could go to the next slide. So this is just a snapshot of what we did at Compass last year. And I just looking at first, the 51% of those who stayed with us saw an increase in income. I'm very happy about that and very proud of that. Happy to see that the number of people we worked with were able to increase their own stability because of our work with them. And then our guests who moved into permanent housing out of shelter. That is hard to do. That 32% rate is among the best of all of the shelter programs in the city of Seattle. We know, as Gregg has told you, that affordable housing is quite scarce. And so connecting people with that affordable housing takes skill, it takes persistence. And our housing navigators have that skill and they have that persistence. And they work very hard to help folks who are in our shelters get off the streets for good. And if we could go to our my last slide. And I do want to just say thank you to you all, our donors who, the dollars that our donors give us are the most flexible dollars we have. And that allows us to invest for growth. And so I'm going to introduce David Duea from Lutheran Community Services Northwest, who's going to talk about our plans for growth. I will say, as we're moving out of our 100th year, that Lutheran Community Services Northwest is in its 100th year. And so I'm going to let my younger sibling from Lutheran Community Services Northwest conclude our evening together.
Mary, you're a great big sister, so thank you. I just, first of all, I want to thank Gregg. What a great presentation. We are making more and more of our strategy decisions based on really good data. So Gregg, thank you. We're in the midst of our next strategic plan. So that was perfect timing and very eye-opening. I had some assumptions about homelessness that have been squashed tonight. And that's going to make all of us better at making decisions about where do we put our precious few dollars. I have very short comments, mostly just to talk about how much I love our affiliation with Compass. When Mary and I got together for coffee, you know, it came very apparent that we had to spend 5 minutes on mission. We both are aligned on mission. We care for the whole person. We don't just treat them as a number, but as a whole person and as someone that we want to put resources around to thrive and no longer need our services. Our work with refugees, early childhood development, and especially behavioral health, immigration, all of these things we feel are going to be an addition to our partnership and affiliation with Compass Housing. One of the things that, and by the way, I had to court Compass because there was other people that wanted to affiliate with Compass and not just us. One of the things is, you know, our history of service that is so complementary and founded by the same person, I might add. So, but the other thing is we have offices all around the Northwest, and the vision of this affiliation is really to take Compass around the Northwest. And I've got district directors that are just bothering me day and night about housing and emergency services that Compass provides. So I would ask you to share in that vision that Compass would take their 101-year history and move it around the Northwest. And conversations are already happening. We're already talking to communities that know the reputation of Compass and the amazing work that their staff do and volunteers and donors. And they want that in their communities. But I will ask you to be patient. As Gregg has mentioned, this is a thoughtful process that takes time. And so we're not going to jump into any projects without really good planning. But with Compass and Lutheran Community Services working together, we're going to at least make a dent in this crisis. So anyway, thank you all. And the future is very bright for Compass and everything that we're doing together.
Wonderful. Thank you both. That was so efficient. Just a reminder, if y'all have questions about Compass or anything Mary and David said, feel free to drop it in the question and answer section. We did have someone asking about what they can do to help the homelessness situation. And I'd say, you being here tonight, like Gregg said, is significant. One of the things I recall Gregg saying to our staff was, the change that needs to happen in the city needs to happen conversation by conversation by conversation. And that requires some bravery, some human connection, some vulnerability. And that's what we're trying to do here tonight with you. So hopefully you can all go out and have conversations too, because I think that in order to really make a dent, we have to consider talking more about the issue with our friends and family. You can also, of course, Mary, did you want to add something?
Well, I would say we have volunteer opportunities at Compass.
Yes.
And they're getting to be more, we had to shut down a lot of opportunities during COVID, but we're starting now to reopen. And you would find those on our website. And Jennifer, who's here, is our volunteer manager. And she'd be happy if you wanted to put something in the chat of your interest, she'd be happy to follow up.
Certainly. We're really happy to have a couple volunteer events back for the first time, and it's all connected to the holidays. So we'll be doing some gift wrapping parties as folks who support Compass are purchasing gifts for families who live in our housing. We then wrap those thoughtfully. There's also going to be a cookie drive where if you like to bake and you would like some of our shelters to enjoy some of your holiday treats, we have some opportunities there as well. The email that Jenny is best reachable at is in the chat. And we'll, of course, follow up with you after the meeting with a link to things. One of the other things we'll follow up with you is the book. Gregg's book is now available for pre-order, and there is a discount code that shaves off a good chunk of change that we'll provide you with after the meeting ends. I don't see any more questions in the chat or anywhere else. Yeah.
Well, anyone who's interested in Compass can always reach out to any one of us, and we promise we will get back to you. So
yeah, and many thanks to those of you who've supported us through our centennial celebration this year. We didn't expect to do it in the pandemic, but we're happy you were there for us, so appreciate that. Alrighty, we'll go ahead and conclude the meeting. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Gregg.